On the evening of February 26, 2026, at France's prestigious film ceremony, the César Awards, the auditorium suddenly became lively when a familiar Hollywood face stepped onto the stage. Jim Carrey was presented with an honorary César in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the art of cinema. It should have been a moment of pure celebration. Yet only a few hours after the ceremony ended, social media exploded with a strangely intense debate. The reason wasn't his speech, and it wasn't the award itself. Instead, millions of people online began questioning the very person who had stood on that stage. Clips from the ceremony were cut, zoomed in, and analyzed frame by frame. Some viewers claimed his eyes looked different, his expressions slower than before. Others insisted that his face simply didn't look like the Jim Carrey they remembered. But the detail that fueled the conspiracy theories the most came from something seemingly trivial: his signature. In a backstage video, Carrey was seen signing an autograph for a fan using his right hand. Almost immediately, online forums began circulating the claim that he had always been known to be left-handed. For some people, this was treated as proof that the man who appeared in Paris was not the real Jim Carrey. Within hours, increasingly bizarre theories began spreading. Some suggested that Hollywood had replaced him with a permanent body double. Others talked about cloning technology. A few even posted detailed analyses of his facial bone structure as if they were investigating a criminal case. Things became even more chaotic when the famous makeup artist Alexis Stone posted a photo on social media. In the picture, Stone appeared transformed into Jim Carrey with an almost unbelievable level of accuracy. The image was shared millions of times, leading many people to believe they had just witnessed some kind of elaborate Hollywood switch. Even a few celebrities, including Megan Fox, admitted they were confused by the eerie resemblance. Eventually, representatives for Carrey and the organizers of the César Awards were forced to issue official statements. There was no cloning, no secret body double, and no conspiracy. The man standing on stage that night was indeed Jim Carrey himself, a performer who had spent months preparing part of his speech in French as a gesture of respect to the French audience. Yet ironically, even after the truth was confirmed, the debate online didn't completely disappear. Because for many people, the real question was never whether that man was Jim Carrey. The real question was, what had happened to the man who once made the entire world laugh until they cried? And to understand why his face today feels so unfamiliar to some viewers, the story must go back long before the lights of Hollywood, to the moment when comedy first became the mask he used to protect himself. Before becoming one of the most recognizable comedic faces in the world, Jim Carrey discovered a simple but powerful truth: making people laugh could change how they saw him. As a child, Carrey realized that with just one strange facial expression or an exaggerated movement, an entire room could burst into laughter. And in that moment, every eye would turn toward him. Not out of pity, but out of joy. Over time, that ability became his greatest weapon. Carrey could twist and stretch his face in ways almost no one else could replicate. His exaggerated expressions and cartoon-like physical movements eventually defined the unique style of physical comedy that audiences around the world would instantly recognize. But for Carrey, it wasn't just a natural talent. It was also a form of armor. People who worked with him during his early years in comedy clubs in Toronto and Los Angeles often remembered something striking. Carrey didn't just want the audience to laugh, he seemed to need it. When a room fell silent, he became tense, but when laughter erupted, his energy exploded as if he had suddenly been refueled. Some fellow comedians later said that Carrey performed with the intensity of someone trying to prove something to the entire world. And in truth, that was exactly what he was doing. Behind those wild performances, there were hints that Carrey's inner life was far more complex than the comedic image he projected on stage. In later interviews, he began sharing thoughts that surprised many people. Philosophical reflections about identity, about the meaning of existence, and about how human beings construct personas to be accepted by society. At the same time, another side of Carrey slowly began to emerge. When he wasn't in front of a camera, he often spent hours alone painting. His artwork looked nothing like what audiences might expect from a comedian. Many of his paintings were dark, intense, and sometimes even unsettling, filled with emotional chaos and raw expression. They were works Carrey rarely spoke about in detail, but they revealed a part of him the public had rarely seen. That contrast made many people realize that behind Carrey's loud, explosive laughter, there might be a far deeper story. A story that began long before fame, when his family faced hardships most audiences had never imagined. And it was during that period, before the stage, before Hollywood, that Jim Carrey learned his first lesson about surviving through laughter in the cold winters of Canada. Those who only know Jim Carrey from his wild, on-screen performances often find it difficult to imagine that his childhood was marked by severe poverty. Before the spotlight, before Hollywood, the Carrey family had once fallen into deep instability. In 1975, when Jim was about 12 years old, his father, Percy Carrey, suddenly lost his job as an accountant. The event quickly pushed the entire family into financial crisis. Unable to afford their home, they were forced to leave. For a period of time, the Carreys lived out of an old Volkswagen van, sometimes pitching a small tent at campgrounds around Ontario to survive the freezing Canadian nights. For a child, that wasn't just material hardship. It was the constant feeling of uncertainty, not knowing where you would sleep the next night or whether your family would ever recover. In that environment, Jim became a keen observer. He learned to read the moods of the people around him, especially his parents. And whenever the atmosphere at home became heavy, he did the one thing he knew how to do: make people laugh. But when Jim turned 16, reality forced him to grow up faster than anyone would wish. He dropped out of high school to help support his family. His job was far from glamorous. Night shifts at a factory in Ontario, where he and other family members worked as janitors and maintenance staff after the production lines had shut down. Those long nights etched a lesson deep into Carrey's mind, a lesson he would often repeat years later. Life can change in an instant. But the most painful moment was still ahead. In 1982, a shocking event within the family left a deep psychological scar on Carrey. He discovered his father unconscious after an overdose in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to escape the overwhelming pressure of their circumstances. Although Percy survived, the image haunted Jim for years. It was the first time he truly realized that adults, the people he once believed were the strongest, could also break. After that moment, Carrey became even more determined to pursue his dream of comedy. Not simply for fame or money, but because he believed that if he could make the world laugh, he might be able to lift his family out of the darkness they had endured. And just over a decade later, something that once seemed almost impossible actually happened. When Jim Carrey entered the year 1994, a year that Hollywood would later describe as one that completely changed the history of comedy films. After years of struggling through comedy clubs and small television roles, Jim Carrey's true breakthrough came in 1994, a year that even Hollywood later admitted was nearly impossible to repeat. Within just 12 months, Carrey appeared in 3 comedy films that became global sensations. The first was Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, where he played an eccentric pet detective with a style of expression unlike anything audiences had seen before. The film was initially dismissed by many critics, but audiences reacted in the opposite way. They were captivated by Carrey's almost uncontrollable energy. Just a few months later, he appeared in The Mask. The film was not only a box office success, but also turned Carrey into a cultural phenomenon. His ability to control his facial expressions and body movements brought the cartoon-like character on screen to life in a way that the technology of the time could hardly achieve without a performer like him. And before 1994 came to an end, Carrey created another sensation with Dumb and Dumber, a film that many believe no one else could have made that foolish character so memorable. 3 films, 3 major successes, and within just 1 year, Jim Carrey went from a rising comedian to the biggest comedy star in the world. That explosive success quickly changed his position in the film industry. In 1996, when he took the leading role in The Cable Guy, Carrey signed a contract worth $20 million, becoming the first actor in Hollywood history to reach that figure for a single film. It was a symbolic milestone, proving that a comedian could stand at the very top of box office power. But fame also brought pressures that Carrey had never been prepared to face. As his popularity grew, audience expectations grew with it. Every new role had to be bigger, funnier, and more outrageous than the one before. Gradually, the man behind those characters began to feel as if he were trapped inside the very mask that had made him famous. Years later, Carrey said that fame is like a promise society makes to you, that once you achieve it, you will feel complete. But when he actually reached the top, he began to realize something strange. The laughter of the entire world still could not fill the deep emptiness inside. And just as the brilliance of his career was shining at its brightest, personal upheavals in Carrey's life began to appear, slowly pulling him away from the cheerful image the public had always known. While Jim Carrey's career was soaring at an incredible speed, his private life was gradually becoming more complex and fragile in ways the public rarely saw. People close to him often said that Carrey had an incredibly open heart, but that openness also made him more vulnerable than many realized. His first marriage to Melissa Wimmer began in 1987, when Carrey was still struggling to find his place in Hollywood. At the time, the two shared difficult years and hoped that Jim's career would eventually take off. Together they had a daughter, Jane Erin Carrey, who would later pursue a career in the arts as well. But when success arrived at overwhelming speed in the 1990s, the pressure of fame began to seep into their marriage. Intense filming schedules, relentless media attention, and the chaotic rhythm of Hollywood slowly created distance between them. By 1995, the marriage quietly came to an end. Not long afterward, Carrey entered his second marriage with actress Lauren Holly, who had starred alongside him in Dumb and Dumber 4. But this marriage was even shorter. After less than a year, the two decided to divorce. Two broken marriages before the age of 40 made Carrey increasingly cautious when speaking about love. However, the most painful tragedy in his personal life came years later. In 2015, his former girlfriend, Catriona White, passed away after an overdose. Her death quickly became the focus of international media attention and was followed by a series of legal accusations directed at Carrey. Although those lawsuits were later dismissed by the courts, that period remained one of the darkest chapters of his life. Carrey rarely spoke publicly about the event, but people close to him said he was deeply affected by the tragedy. For someone already sensitive to the pain of others, the event left a wound that was difficult to heal. At the same time, Carrey also faced other challenges within his family. In 2012, his daughter, Jane Erin Carrey, was diagnosed with autism. For Carrey, this was not a tragedy but a new challenge in life. Yet it also made him even more aware of the responsibilities of fatherhood and the fragility of life. These experiences gradually changed how the public viewed Jim Carrey. Behind the man who once made the entire world laugh, a more complex figure began to emerge. Someone struggling with emotions far deeper than many had imagined. And as personal pain accumulated over the years, Carrey eventually began to reveal a secret he had kept hidden for decades, a quiet battle that audiences had never seen behind the stage lights. After years of avoiding the subject in public, Jim Carrey finally acknowledged a truth he had lived with for a very long time. Depression did not appear after fame arrived. It had been quietly present in his life for decades. In several rare interviews, Carrey revealed that he had used Prozac since the late 1980s to manage what he described as a low, constant sense of despair. It was not just occasional sadness. It felt more like a fog that always existed in the mind, sometimes thin, sometimes so dense that everything felt heavy. What surprised many people was that the period when he struggled with this condition coincided with the brightest years of his career. While audiences around the world laughed uncontrollably at his eccentric characters on screen, Carrey was privately battling thoughts few people knew about. That contrast sometimes made him feel as if he were living two completely different lives. One life belonged to the stage, where he was explosive energy, where laughter never stopped. And the other life was much quieter, where he had to work every day to maintain his emotional balance. Over time, Carrey began questioning his dependence on medication. He never denied that it had helped him through difficult periods, but he also felt he needed another path to better understand himself. Gradually, he reduced the dosage and eventually stopped using it altogether, turning instead to meditation, painting, and philosophy as ways to face his emotions. During that process, Carrey began speaking more openly about his deep reflections on identity and existence. He started reading and studying the works of Eckhart Tolle, whose ideas had a significant influence on how he viewed consciousness and presence. These changes eventually led Carrey to a decision that surprised many fans. After years of living under the spotlight, he began to wonder whether it was time to step away from Hollywood, not because of failure, but because he wanted to rediscover a sense of peace that fame had never truly provided. After many years in the spotlight, the biggest turning point in Jim Carrey's life came from something surprisingly ordinary: illness and forced silence. In 2017, while working on a project related to the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, Carrey developed severe pneumonia and was bedridden for several days. For the first time in decades of non-stop movement between film sets, interviews, and promotional tours, he was forced to completely stop. During that time, Carrey said he began to look at his life in a different way. Without roles to play and without an overwhelming schedule, he had to confront a question he had long avoided. If he was no longer Jim Carrey on screen, what remained? The answer slowly emerged through things far simpler than Hollywood. He devoted time to painting, a passion he had pursued for many years but rarely spoke about publicly. He meditated and read philosophy, especially the works of Eckhart Tolle. Instead of seeking recognition from audiences, Carrey began searching for inner peace. By 2022, he announced that he was ready to step away from Hollywood. Not because he had run out of ideas or because the industry had turned its back on him, but simply because he felt he had already said everything he needed to say through film. His new life moved at a slower pace, much of it spent in Maui, where he could paint, reflect, and live away from the machinery of fame. Yet even after deciding to step back, Hollywood had not completely let him go. When producers of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 sent him a special script, reportedly printed with 24-karat gold ink along with an enormous salary offer, Carrey eventually laughed and agreed to return once more as Dr. Robotnik. Even so, this return carried a different meaning. It was no longer a pursuit of fame, but more like a gentle farewell to the profession that had shaped his entire life. Perhaps Jim Carrey's face looks different today, not because of surgery or any internet mystery. It is simply the face of a man who has lived a full 64 years, through poverty, fame, loss, and the long journey of rediscovering himself, while still making the world laugh for decades.